He grew up knowing something most children never have to understand, that his existence carried a label long before he understood what labels even were. Born into a palace, wrapped in blankets, embroidered with crests and titles, surrounded by gold-framed portraits and ancient traditions, Prince Harry entered the world already defined by two words: the Spare. It was more than a nickname, more than a joke, more than a royal saying whispered behind closed doors. It was a role, a job, a shadow, a destiny crafted for him before he even opened his eyes. Harry was just a baby when the phrase first attached itself to him, echoing through newspaper columns, whispered by courtiers, referenced by staff, spoken casually by people who would never know him beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. He didn't know it then, he couldn't know it, but everyone around him did. They looked at him and saw the unspoken truth. He wasn't the heir, he was the backup. A backup child, a backup prince, a backup future. Thus heir. And as he grew older, the weight of that identity settled onto his shoulders, not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly, like dust gathering on a shelf no one ever cleans. He learned the meaning of the words the same way a child learns the alphabet, piece by piece, painfully through moments he would never forget. Harry remembers being very young, small enough that his feet barely touched the floor when he sat at the long, polished table in the family dining room. His brother, William, the heir, sat with a posture even a child understood was expected of him. He watched him, mimicking, learning, absorbing. Their father, now King Charles, spoke about duty, responsibility, and lineage. Words heavy and old, words a child might not grasp fully but could feel in tone and structure. William's future was laid out in front of him like a red carpet rolled across decades. Harry's future, on the other hand, was left blank, empty, undefined. The Spare was not given a roadmap. He was given a purpose: be available if needed. Beyond that, silence. He grew up in palaces that felt like museums, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had ruled, conquered, and commanded armies. Harry would stare at those portraits, looking at the eyes of kings who never smiled in paintings, trying to imagine their lives. But no matter how hard he stared, he only saw what he wasn't: heir, leader, future king. Even as a child, he heard jokes. Gentle, affectionate, but cutting in ways no one intended to process. A distant relative once chuckled and said, "At least there's a spare in case anything happens." Harry remembered the laughter in the room, remembered the casualness of it, and remembered how he felt small, without knowing why. As he grew, the world grew louder. Reporters learned his name. Photographers learned his face. Headlines learned the word Spare and wrote it like a brand. He was the second-born, the extra, the prince whose role was to support, not shine. It was a strange dynamic. Loving his brother deeply, being proud of him, being tied to him by blood and childhood and royal expectations, but knowing he would always walk 2 steps behind him, literally and symbolically. As he grew older, he noticed how people positioned them. William lead. Harry followed. William told reporters about duty. Harry made them laugh. William would be king one day. Harry would be there. The phrase heir and spare floated everywhere, from documentaries to gossip magazines to insider books. Harry tried to shrug it off, pretend it didn't bother him, pretend it didn't shape him. But children don't forget the words they grow up hearing, especially when those words define how the world sees them. He remembers the moment he understood it fully. He was still young, but old enough to grasp the wheat. One day during a family gathering, an older relative said something that burned into his memory forever. "You're here to support your brother, Harold. That's your job. You're the Spare." There it was, clear, simple, unfiltered. Not said with malice, just truth. Royal truth. The truth of a monarchy built on hierarchy, tradition, and order. Harry laughed it off then. What else could he do? He didn't control the system he was born into. He didn't choose his title. He didn't choose his family's expectations. He didn't choose to be the second born. He didn't choose to be the extra. But something inside him shifted that day. Something small, something subtle, something he didn't talk about for years. The sense that he wasn't fully seen as an individual, that he wasn't valued for who he was, but for what he could potentially provide if something terrible happened to his brother. A backup heart, a backup body, a backup life. Growing up under that kind of shadow does something to you. It shapes your identity, the way you see yourself, the way you understand your worth. For Harry, it created a constant internal conflict. He loved his brother deeply, admired him, followed him, protected him. But at the same time, he felt invisible beside him. Like William was the sun and he was orbiting nearby, reflecting light but never generating it. Harry found an outlet in mischief, in humor, in rebellion. If he couldn't be the heir, he could at least be memorable. He could be the fun one, the wild one, the unpredictable one. The spare who made headlines, the spare who made people laugh, the spare who lived freely because he didn't carry the pressure of the crown. But as the years passed, even that identity became another cage. Every mistake he made was magnified, every misstep captured, every moment of pain dissected. He wasn't allowed to simply grow up. He grew up under flashbulbs and commentary, labeled again and again as the royal spare, the supporting actor in the story of the future king. He remembers boarding school, the cold stone walls, the uniforms, the long hallways. He remembers being watched, judged, compared. He remembers teachers whispering about him as if he wasn't in the room. He remembers being reminded, subtly and not so subtly, that he didn't carry the same expectations as William. He wasn't being groomed for the throne. Yet he was still groomed to support the throne, groomed to be the loyal brother, the reliable second, the quiet backup. He was taught how to walk behind William, how to bow correctly, how to smile for cameras, how to symbolize unity even when he felt split inside. And all the while, he carried something unspoken, the pain of being valued for his bloodline, but not for his individuality. He loved his family, he still does, but love doesn't erase wounds. Love doesn't erase labels. Love doesn't erase decades of being reminded of your position. As he grew older, the cracks widened, the expectations deepened, the scrutiny intensified. He became the prince the tabloids hunted, the one they called reckless, the one they photographed invading his privacy, the one they judged more harshly because he wasn't protected by the title of heir. The world watched him as entertainment, not as a human being. And through it all, the word spare remained like an invisible tattoo on his heart, present, permanent, painful. A constant reminder that in the royal hierarchy, he was not necessary, just useful. But Harry was never just a role. He was never just a title. He was never just the extra. Slowly, quietly, painfully, he began to realize that being the spare could either break him or transform him, that he could either exist in his brother's shadow or step beyond them, that he could either exist in his brother's shadow or carve out a life where shadow or sunlight didn't define him. He didn't know then what that life would look like or how he would get there. He didn't know how the media would react, how the family would respond, how the world would judge him. He didn't know what stepping outside the box meant for himself, for the monarchy, for history. But he knew one thing clearly. He could no longer be only the spare, not for the institution, not for the public, not even for his family. He needed to become someone more, someone whole, someone real, someone who could breathe outside of a title he never chose. And behind the palace walls, behind the headlines and traditions, Prince Harry began the slow journey towards becoming that person, not as the spare, but as himself.
The older Harry became,
the more the word spare shifted from a nickname into a wound, a quiet bruise pressed into his childhood, his identity, and the shape of his future. It was never shouted. It was never carved across his door. It was never spoken with cruelty, but it was there, always there, an uninvited shadow with a polite smile. He remembers the exact moment he realized that spare wasn't just a label, but a blueprint, a plan, a position crafted for him before he even knew what a position was. He had been sitting beside William during a briefing, young, bored, restless, kicking the legs of his chair, while royal advisors discussed future duties, appearances, obligations. They talked to William, they looked at William, they outlined his destiny in clean, confident strokes. Then one advisor glanced at Harry and said with a lightness that didn't match the meaning, "And if anything should happen to the heir, well, that's why we have a spare." A few people chuckled. William shifted awkwardly. Harry lowered his eyes. No one meant to hurt him. No one realized they did, because in their world, the term was practical, logistical, a centuries-old royal concept spoken without hesitation. But for Harry, the syllables carried a weight that settled in his bones. He was the contingency plan, the emergency option, the backup soul meant to fill a throne only in tragedy. And for the first time, he wondered what his life would look like if he stepped outside that definition, if he dared to exist for reasons beyond duty, obligation, or possibility. As he matured, the world he lived in felt more like a beautiful cage, golden, polished, filled with privilege, but a cage nonetheless. Every hallway echoed with expectation. Every staircase led to responsibility. Every room carried portraits of people who had followed strict paths, unbroken lines of tradition stretching backward through time. He admired those ancestors, but he didn't want to become their copy. Harry's teenage years were marked with a restless energy, a push and pull between rebellion and desire for belonging. Reporters trailed him incessantly, capturing every stumble as if they were waiting for the spare to fail, waiting for the story to write itself. He was supposed to be charming, but not too loud. Funny, but not reckless. Free-spirited, but not too free. And when he pushed boundaries, as all teenagers do, the headlines sharpened. They called him a wild prince, a problem prince, a lost prince. They used his mistakes as entertainment, his struggles as spectacle, his pain as profit. Being the spare meant that nothing he did was truly private. Nothing belonged solely to him. Not his joy, not his grief, not even his silence. But the real fracture didn't come from the press. It came from the expectation that he would always walk behind William, not beside him as a brother, but behind him as a subordinate. He loved William deeply, but loving someone doesn't mean ignoring the space growing between you. He watched as William slipped naturally into the role of heir, responsible, serious, shaped for leadership since birth. And he admired him. He celebrated him. But he also felt distance forming in the spaces between their futures. William was being prepared. Harry was being parked. A standby. Just in case. Always available, rarely necessary. And every time he watched William train for a life Harry would never live, the divide widened. Not by anger, not by jealousy, but by fate. Sometimes when Harry walked through palace corridors, he would see staff straighten as William passed, bows slightly deeper, footsteps quieter, eyes more attentive. Then Harry would walk by seconds later, and the room would shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for him to feel the difference. It wasn't personal, it was structural, woven into centuries of monarchy, an unspoken rule: the heir commands the room, and the spare fills it. Harry pushed through this existence with humor, leaning into his own identity as the light-hearted brother, the soldier prince, the one who could connect easily with people, the one who brought warmth to royal events that often felt stiff and staged. But as he grew, even humor couldn't shield him from the truth.
He wanted purpose, not position. He wanted meaning, not machinery. He wanted a life that belonged to him, not a destiny assigned to him. The royal system didn't know what to do with a man like that. He found temporary escape in the military, structure without monarchy, identity without titles, purpose without comparison. In Afghanistan, he wasn't the spare. He was an officer, a pilot, a teammate. He was Harry, not HRH. Flying helicopters in the desert, feeling the roar of engines under his control, reminded him what freedom tasted like. Out there, far from palaces, far from cameras, far from expectations, he felt like a whole person. He fought. He risked. He served. He bled. He grew. For once, the uniform gave him something royalty never had: equality. But he couldn't stay there forever. Eventually, the world dragged him back. The press discovered his location. Security became impossible. He was forced to return home, not by choice, but by necessity. He returned to palaces that felt smaller now, corridors that felt tighter, duties that felt heavier. Something had shifted inside him. He had tasted what life could look like when he wasn't defined by the word spare, and the taste didn't leave easily. He wanted purpose, he wanted love, he wanted freedom. He wanted something that felt like life, not obligation. And then everything changed. He met someone who looked at him and didn't see a title, didn't see duty, didn't see a supporting role. She saw him. Just him. A man who laughed with his whole voice. A man who carried old wounds with quiet strength. A man who wanted more than he was allowed to ask for. Her name was Meghan, and with her, Harry found the missing piece of himself, a partner who didn't exist within the hierarchy, who didn't see him as the spare, who didn't belong to the institution that shaped him. Their love wasn't a fairy tale. It was a lightning strike, quick, undeniable, impossible to ignore. But with every step they took together, the cracks in his royal role widened. The press became relentless. The scrutiny intensified. The palace grew tense around them. Old systems resisted change. Old expectations resurfaced. Old labels whispered louder. Suddenly, every choice he made was questioned. Every emotion analyzed. Every move criticized. Not because he was the heir, but because he was the spare, stepping outside the script written for him. He wasn't supposed to lead. He wasn't supposed to disrupt. He wasn't supposed to choose his own path. But Harry had spent a lifetime carrying expectations he never chose, and now he wanted something he had never been allowed to want: a life shaped by love, not lineage. He wanted space to breathe, to heal, to grow. He wanted a future where his children would not inherit the same scars he carried from being born into a role that defined him before he had a voice. He wanted to protect Meghan from the brutal machinery of the British press. He wanted to shield her from the harassment he had watched destroy the women in his life, his mother, his past partners, and now the woman he loved. He wanted to rewrite the narrative for his family. He wanted to break the cycle. So the spare did something unheard of. He stepped away, not quietly, not secretly, not obediently. He walked out of a system that never asked what he wanted and never cared to know. And the world gasped. Some called him brave. Some called him foolish. Some called him selfish. Some called him liberated. But Harry knew the truth. He walked away not because he wanted to abandon duty, but because he wanted to embrace identity. He wanted to be a husband, a father, a man, not a placeholder for a throne he would never sit on. Leaving the institution felt like tearing muscle from bone, painful, necessary, inevitable. He had spent his entire life inside a framework built for someone else. Now, for the first time, he was living for himself. But stepping away didn't erase the past. It didn't silence the word spare. It didn't heal the wounds overnight. Instead, it forced him to confront the truth he had avoided for decades. He couldn't change the role he was born into, but he could change the man he became because of it. And that's what he did. He began telling his story, not out of revenge, but out of release. The wounds needed air. The truth needed light. The past needed acknowledgement. He wasn't the villain. He wasn't the victim. He was simply human. A man trying to make sense of a life built around expectations he never agreed to. He spoke about the pain of being despair, about the loneliness, about the comparisons, about the heartbreak of living in the shadow of someone you love, about the toll the press took, about losing his mother in the public eye, about nearly losing himself in the chaos of it all. He spoke because silence had suffocated him for too long. And when he finally opened up,
Freedom didn't come quietly. It didn't arrive in a neat package or a gentle transition. For Harry, stepping away from the royal world was like stepping out of a storm, only to realize the wind followed him. But even with all the noise, all the criticism, all the headlines screaming his name, he felt something he had never felt before. Space, air, possibility. He remembers the first morning he woke up in his new life. No palace bells, no scheduled appearances, no royal staff knocking on the door with a list of obligations. Just sunlight filtering through curtains, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the quiet sound of Meghan humming to herself. For the first time ever, silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like choice. There were no photographers outside the window, no courtiers waiting in the hallway, no ancient expectations hovering above him like a crown he didn't ask for. Just life, a simple one, his own. Yet the past didn't disappear just because he walked away. Titles stay written into the bones. Old wounds don't dissolve with the distance. The word spare doesn't stop echoing just because he's on a different continent. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit outside under the California sky, surrounded by stars so bright they made Buckingham Palace chandeliers feel cold and artificial. He would breathe in the warm air and feel the weight he carried shift, not vanish, but transform. He realized something powerful. He didn't run from the monarchy. He ran toward himself. The world had opinions about that. Endless ones. Some loud, some cruel, some supportive, some confused. But none of them understood the quiet truth. For the first time in his life, he wasn't performing. He wasn't the prince waving on balconies. He wasn't the soldier under scrutiny. He wasn't the brother walking 2 steps behind. He wasn't the spare. He was simply Harry, a husband, a father, a man learning who he was when no one was watching. But healing is never a straight path. There were days he missed his brother, missed the childhood bond, the connection forged in early years before titles pulled them onto separate tracks. He missed inside jokes, missed the closeness they once shared long before the world turned their relationship into a spectacle. He wished things had been different, simpler, kinder. But monarchy doesn't make room for simplicity or kindness. It makes room for hierarchy. And hierarchy had always demanded space between them. He didn't blame William. He didn't blame himself. He blamed the system, a system that shaped them into roles before it shaped them into men. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it softened it. Still, the deeper Harry explored himself, the more he uncovered. The grief he carried for his mother, the pressure he endured growing up, the trauma of being chased by paparazzi since the age of 2. He remembered the flashbulbs that never dimmed, the headlines that never stopped, the relentless eyes that followed him even as a child. He remembered nights when he and William pressed their faces against the backseat windows of the car, trying to understand why motorcycles swarmed them, why grown adults chased them, why cameras flashed like lightning through tinted glass. He remembers how his mother held their hands tightly, whispering calming words, even though her own voice trembled. Losing her shattered him in ways he never fully understood until adulthood. Her death didn't just break his heart, it broke his trust in the world around him. He grew up learning to fear the press, then learning to endure the press, then learning to fight the press, then learning to escape the press. Every stage of his life had been shaped by forces he didn't choose, until he chose to walk away. He wanted to protect his family with a fierceness that came from decades of watching history repeat itself. He saw Meghan cry. He saw headlines twist her humanity into caricature. He saw her dragged across front pages the way his mother had been. He felt the old terror, the same terror he felt as a boy watching his mother crumble under pressure. He wouldn't let it happen again. Not to the woman he loved, not to his children, not to anyone he could protect. Walking away wasn't betrayal, it was survival. And yet, even in his new world, the past whispered to him. Old habits tugged, old insecurities resurfaced, old labels crept back. He would hear the word spare, sometimes reading it accidentally online, overhearing it in a documentary, catching it in a discussion about royal tradition. And every time it stung less than before, but it still stung. He wasn't angry about the word. Not anymore. He was simply done letting it define him. Harry realized something profound during this chapter of his life, that identity is not what others call you, but what you decide to become. And the life he was building now was shaped by his decisions, not his lineage. He built a home filled with laughter instead of protocol, a home where he could walk barefoot, cook breakfast, take out the trash, and live without cameras tracking his every gesture. A home where his children could grow without being told who they belonged to before they were old enough to speak. He found joy in simple things: morning walks with the dogs, reading with his kids, watching Meghan laugh across the table, planting rosemary in the garden. These moments mattered more than titles ever could. Some nights, he would hold his daughter in his arms, feeling her tiny hand rest on his chest, and think about the generations of royal children who never had this kind of freedom. Children raised in palaces, not playgrounds. Children told what they would become, not asked. He wanted better for his family, for himself, for the pieces of his heart he carried forward. But even with freedom, even with love, healing remained a lifelong journey. There were days when memories pressed too hard, days when he felt the old ache of being the second-born, days when the media twisted his story into something unrecognizable, days when loneliness crept in unexpectedly, not for the institution, but for the fragments of family life he once knew. He allowed himself to feel it, not suppress it, not hide it, just feel it. Because honesty was the core of his new life. Honesty with himself, with Meghan, with the world. He had spent too many years smiling for cameras that wanted a role, not a person. He wouldn't go back. The more he spoke openly, in interviews, in conversations, and writing, the more he felt the weight lift. Not entirely, but enough. People didn't always understand him. People didn't always agree with him. People didn't always support him. But he wasn't speaking to be understood or accepted. He was speaking to be free. One evening, while sitting on the patio with the sun setting behind the hills, Meghan asked him quietly, "Do you ever wish things had been normal?" Harry looked at her, the sky turning orange behind her silhouette, and answered the only way he truly could.
I don't wish for normal, I wish for peace. And peace was what he had been chasing his whole life, through rebellion, through service, through heartbreak, through escape. He found pieces of it in nature, pieces in love, pieces in fatherhood, pieces in truth. And slowly, those pieces formed a life that felt whole. He no longer needed to run from the word spare, because it no longer owned him. It was part of his story, not the story itself. A chapter, not a destiny. A label, not a definition. He had reclaimed his narrative, rewritten his identity, rebuilt his life, step by step, choice by choice, truth by truth. Now, when Harry looks at his reflection, he doesn't see the spare. He sees the survivor, the protector, the father, the husband, the man who broke a generational cycle because he refused to let history claim another life he loved. He sees someone who walked through fire, not because he wanted to, but because the only way out was through. He sees someone who chose love over legacy, healing over hierarchy, truth over tradition. He sees someone who finally became what he always deserved to be. Enough. Just as he is. Without title, without role, without expectation. Just Harry. And for the first time in his life, that is more than enough.